It is a truth universally acknowledged that someone in want of sharing their opinion online must be sitting at a desk. So I pulled my dining table over to my couch. I'm legit now. First I hesitated making this video because I didn't want to perpetuate the stereotype that you can't criticize YA because then you get a horde of angry teenagers after you. That's not true, because I'm not a teenager. And I'm also really not angry. Once every few months this discussion seems to arise again, revolving around a question that does not seem to have an answer, and that is, YA bad? That was a Twitter incident that sparked the most outrage, and then around that same time there was a video uploaded by popular fantasy YouTuber Daniel Green talking about his problems with YA fantasy. And I just want to make this video not to like start any drama, but just because I think it's a discussion worth having, and now seems to be the time to have the discussion. Both of those incidents I mentioned are very different. I will address both of them in this video, and then in the third part of this video I will open up a completely new discussion. So I want to start this video letting you guys know where I stand when it comes to YA and reading, because I feel like that's important context to have. I'm someone who loves YA books. For years I used to only read YA books. Lately I've been reading mostly adult books. There's not really a reason for that. I don't really know why that happened. Don't read into it too much. It's not that deep, but I guess you could say that I'm pretty well read in both YA and adult. My favorite genre is definitely fantasy, which is important because for the majority of this video we're going to be talking about fantasy. The surprising thing is that although with pretty much every other genre I'm now mostly reading adult, when it comes to fantasy I'm still mostly reading YA fantasy, and I have not ventured too much into adult fantasy yet. But on the other hand, if I look at all of my favorite fantasy books, pretty much all of them are adults. Some of my favorite adult fantasy books are Night House by Leigh Bardugo, the books by Naomi Novik, of course my all-time favorite book Vicious by V.E. Schwab, although this could also be science fiction. And then we have A Gathering of Shadows, the wonderful sequel to A Darker Shade of Magic. But of course it's going to be completely based on my opinions and on what I know. So if you're watching this video and you think, oh my gosh Leonie, you were completely wrong, please let me know in the comments and we can talk about it, because that's the point of this video. So let's start with the Twitter drama. A while ago there was someone who shared on Twitter their new floating bookshelves, which got a lot of attraction. A lot of people retweeted it, a lot of people talked about it because people had opinions on floating shelves. But because of this, it really reined in a wide audience, and with that it reined in a lot of people who had some opinions on the fact that all her shelves were mostly filled with YA books, despite the fact that she's an adult. So that sparked some tweets along the lines of, have you ever considered reading a book for adults? Why are you only reading books for teenagers? Basically the general snobbery that us YA lovers often encounter. It's not really new to have this kind of conversation where people think it's wrong and unrespectable to read books that are not for your age range and see YA as just inherently a genre that's bad. So the great thing is that a lot of people immediately countered this, and there was this large discussion going on of people sharing all their books, all their YA books that they do deem like deep and complex and very worthy of people's attention and respect. I think that's great, but I just wanted to throw in a little new argument, something that made me think, and that is that when we counter the argument that YA is not to be valued because it's not complex and deep by showing, no look, here are YA books that are complex and deep, I think we're keeping the idea alive that a book is only respectable and valuable if it's complex and deep. And I have question marks with that. Now I'll admit here that a lot of the YA books that I love are not very complex and deep, and I don't really care. They're just really fun and entertaining, and I relate to the characters, and that's why I like them. I want to dispel this idea that books that are fun and entertaining are not to be taken seriously, because there seems to be this general idea that as soon as a book is enjoyable and fun, then it's immediately lesser than, it is less respectable. And that strikes me as odd, because surely all these people that are reading complex adult literature are reading these books because they enjoy them, because it satisfies them, because it satisfies a need for challenge or a need for reading about different ideas. In the end, we're all reading books because we enjoy the act of reading, because we have this hobby of reading, because we like reading the books that we read. And then it just depends on what you personally find more enjoyable. Just want people to realize that like enjoyable and fun and meaningful and deep are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You know, I read classics once in a while, and let me tell you, I read them because I have a lot of fun with them. I love reading nonfiction because I have fun with learning new things. And I also love reading YA because I have fun. Of course, there's definitely a lot of YA that is deep and complex and beautiful for that, but just don't let anyone convince you that you're wrong for doing things just for your own enjoyment. I mean, I sure hope that you're reading for your own enjoyment, and that's what I wanted to bring into that conversation. So around the same time as this Twitter drama went down, Daniel Green uploaded a video, a two-part video about his problem with YA fantasy, and I saw a lot of people very understandably not wanting to watch that video. I could see a lot of people just expected it to be the same thing again, to be like the same snobbery that they get all the time again, and very understandably people just were not interested in watching that video. I did watch it, and I have to say, it was a pretty good video. I may not disagree with everything, but it was very respectable and definitely not snobbish about YA. It's possible, guys. It's possible to have an actual discussion about YA without being snobbish. Good to know. So let me just quickly summarize the contents of the video. It was basically a video from someone who really likes adult fantasy and has not yet been satisfied with YA fantasy, and he explains why. And he explains why that is. I also don't think there's anything wrong with people disliking YA. Obviously, even after a few books, you can pretty quickly realize if something is for you or not. And he pointed out that YA is basically a marketing genre, which I think is the best way to describe it, because I always had trouble finding like the word for it, because it's not really genre, but it really is just basically a marketing term. When in the rest of this video I refer to the YA audience, I'm referring to people who read YA, not necessarily young adults. Also, is it young adults or young adults? I never know. I hear people saying both. Is this like a US, UK thing? I'm a confused non-native speaker. Anyway, I actually agree with a lot of things Daniel Green says on a surface level, but I'm just here to provide some context. He talks the video talking about how YA is mostly about sales for the publishers, and it's growing with its audience and therefore slowly becoming a little more mature and a little darker. And here he actually touches on a subject that is very relevant for YA right now. We're gonna come back to that later, so put a pin in that one. And then in the rest of the video, he states all his limitations that he sees in YA. Basically comes down to that there's not enough freedom to really get dark with themes and protagonists, that the writing is too juvenile, and that there's basically too much unnecessary underdeveloped romance. So now I'm just gonna talk about things that I did not agree with as a YA reader. I felt like there was not enough awareness of preferences. His first point about how protagonists in YA will never really truly be dark or morally ambiguous, and how this can cause problems with like themes and characterization. And at first I actually agree with this. I would like to see certain YA characters kind of break through that roof that is keeping them from becoming truly morally ambiguous. But then I realized the only reason that I agree with this is because I am someone who has a preference for morally grey characters. I'm someone who really likes a little bit of darkness in my books, and I love reading about moral ambiguous people. But then I realized that a lot of people do not share this opinion. A lot of people don't want to read about morally grey characters. A lot of the YA audience actually likes that YA has characters that you know you can always stand behind, has just heroic protagonists that you can always root for. And I can already just think of the top of my head of a lot of people who just tend to not really like morally grey characters, and they would definitely not enjoy YA books more if they had the freedom to become even darker. I feel like this is even kind of an ongoing conversation that's always happening within the YA community between people who really tend to like the kind of villainous morally grey characters and then the people who just really can't stand them. So this is really a thing of preference, and it's not that the YA genre would be better for everyone. if it allowed itself to be a little more dark, because a lot of people actually like it for never really going too far. And on top of that, I do want to mention that I do think it's very much possible to talk about moral grayness and have moral grayness in your books without ever having your characters do very dark and ambiguous things. For example, This Savage Song is a YA novel that deals with moral grayness as its core theme, and it explores this theme through the internal struggles that the characters have and their internal thoughts and feelings without ever having the characters do actual dark things. So I'd say that moral grayness and actual dark behavior do not necessarily need to go hand in hand, and so you can actually have moral grayness in YA. Yes, I understand that if you are looking for really dark and morally gray characters that you're going to be disappointed in YA books, but I wouldn't go as far as say that that is an inherent flaw in the genre. It's just a preference. And this also goes for what is brought up about romance. This is actually an argument that gets brought up very often, that is that YA just has too much romance, too much unnecessary romance, and here it's really just a preference, because let me tell you, I can assure you that most people who read YA love the fact that every book has a romance. I am someone who is invested in romances really easily, and I will gobble up everything that has a romance. I think if you're not really into romance, that you're gonna be annoyed with it easier and you're not gonna buy into it as quickly. But if you're someone who just really loves to read about the romance, you're gonna be very quick to ship people and root for people. And yes, of course, if it's poorly written, it's not gonna be fun. There's always discussion on some people saying, oh, this is a terrible romance, and then other people being like, no, I'm like super into it. It really depends on what you like in your romance. You know, remember when I read Truly Devious and I genuinely thought the romance was not written well, but still I was so invested in it and I just couldn't wait for the characters to get together? Like, that's just the type of reader I am. I completely understand if you're not someone who really cares about romance, you're gonna be annoyed that YA books have so many romance subplots all the time. But here, it's also the case that a lot of people actually love this. So although I think Daniel Green brought up some valid reasons to not be into YA, I want people to realize that what he calls limitations could actually be reasons to read for a lot of other people. And the second critique that I have on this video is the unawareness of the merit of YA being YA. The main point of the video seemed to be that if YA is growing with its audience, then it should give itself free rein of becoming a little darker and having more intricate prose. Which raises the question for me, how far should we go before YA then just becomes adults? There's so much merit to having YA just be YA. First of all, because everything that I just mentioned, people like different things, and a lot of people actually really like YA for being a little more lighthearted. And also, it's so important to remember that YA has gotten so many people into reading. I remember that for the longest time I thought reading was not something for me. I thought it was boring until I discovered YA books, and now I love reading. You can ask so many people on YA booktube how they got into reading, and I can assure you that like most people are gonna say that they rekindled their love for reading through either Twilight or the Hunger Games. YA gets people into reading because somehow YA seems to provide in a need that other books have a harder time to do. Like, one of the things that I love so much about YA is that it's masterful at taking teenage struggles and just implementing them in stories. Like, for example, the Hunger Games, we talk a lot about how it's such like a great story and a great societal critique, but let's talk about how amazing it is that Suzanne Collins took this teenage problem of not knowing how to present yourself to the world, not knowing who you want to be towards other people, and just took that and turned it into a story. That's the beauty of having that specific YA category. Let YA be YA. By the way, I don't blame Daniel Green for not touching on this in his video, because I understand that it's not really something that you're gonna think of if you didn't grow up with YA. So although I disagree on his statements on how YA should change, he does touch on a question that's very relevant in YA right now. Remember when we put a pin in that a while ago? We're gonna talk about that now again. And what I'm talking about is this discussion on how much should YA grow with its audience. Which brings me to the third part of the video, and this is the moment that I would really like to hear your opinion, because this is just really just my own speculation and based on just things that I've been thinking about, and I would like to know your opinion on what I'm about to say. So now we're mostly going to focus on YA fantasy, and my thesis would be that I don't think YA fantasy should grow more with its audience. Instead, I think adult fantasy should open itself up to more stories that specifically appeal to the YA audience. And note that I'm saying the YA audience, not young adults, but the adults who read YA fantasy. YA is a subgenre that originally was supposed to be targeted at young adults, but nowadays the YA audience mostly consists of people who grew up reading YA, fell in love with reading through YA, and are now growing up and are still reading YA. Publishers know that the majority of the people who read YA right now are actually adults, so they also kind of grow with their audience to kind of keep that group of customers and just keep marketing to them. And that is what we mean when we say that YA is growing up with its audience. So just to illustrate, I've noticed that on YouTube there are a lot of these tier ranking videos lately where people tier rank all the series that they've read, and I've noticed that it seems like we've just collectively decided that all the YA books that came out 10 years are trash and belong in the trash. But all the YA books that came out in like the last 5 years, we do think they're good, which to me shows that the YA genre has changed with us, because if it hadn't, we would still find everything trash. Sometimes this growing with its audience goes too far. One thing that illustrates this is the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. Basically, when the sequel A Court of Mist and Fury came out, there was, let's say, some graphic banging. It was a very successful book. A lot of people really loved it. I think partially because of the graphic banging. It sparked some discussion because some people, some booksellers, some book reviewers were kind of annoyed because they were like, how can we put this book in the same aisle of the books that we specifically recommend for 13-year-olds? Because this is not meant for 13-year-olds. But at the same time, the book did do really well, and it kind of opened the door for more books like this. For example, Six of Crows, which is extremely popular, is I think one of the first books that kind of got a little bit darker. For YA, it was pretty dark. So I recently watched a video by Alexa Dawn. She seemed to be kind of having the same opinions on this as I do, and through that video I learned that this type of YA book is called YA crossover book. It's kind of like this crossover genre between YA and adult, and it seems to be that more and more YA books, because it's growing with its audience, are becoming this weird, elusive crossover genre. It's a type of book that publishers publish that could maybe have been written to be adult, but they publish it as YA just to appeal to the YA market. It's kind of weird when you think about it, that YA is a subgenre that is specifically meant originally for an age group. It's specifically named after an age group. Like, that's bizarre that there is an age group growing with its audience. That's shouldn't be happening. You know, people often talk about how we should push the boundaries of YA, how authors are trying to push the boundaries of YA so that more will be possible within the YA genre and more will be acceptable within the YA genre. And because of that, YA lives in this kind of weird limbo. There's this constant push and pull between, on the one hand, it needs to technically be able to appeal to the 13-year-olds they're technically supposed to appeal to, but on the other hand, the publishers know that they also need to appeal to this huge group of adults who will still read YA. And it's just kind of going back and forth, and I don't think this is a place that is sustainable. Why do publishers keep having to target these adults to read their books? Why are these adults not just reading adult fantasy? In order to answer that question, we gotta talk about the elusive YA vibe. So you've probably heard booktubers or like reviewers coin the term, this book feels like a YA book, when they're recommending books. Like, I've definitely said this about books like Naomi Novik's Uprooted, or I would even say about Ninth House. If you would take out the R-rated content, which granted would be 2/3 of the book, I think you are left with something that really feels like a YA book. But the question is, what does this mean? So I asked you guys on Twitter what you guys meant when you say, or when you hear the term feels like a YA book. And I actually had to say that I disagree with what most of you guys said, which is why I'm very aware of what I'm about to say next is probably gonna be something that maybe not everyone agrees with, which again, if you think that what I say makes no sense, let me know. But a lot of you basically mentioned the easier writing style, and I think there's just a lot more to it. Personally, I would disagree because it would imply that the reason that most adult people are still reading YA is because it has an easier writing style, and I think there's way more to it than that. I actually agreed more with a few of you that mentioned things like faster pace, closer to the character POVs, and specific plots. And yes, I can see that maybe easier writing style might play into it, but I do think there's just more to the YA vibe. Although I don't know exactly what the YA vibe is, I do know that there is such a thing as the YA vibe. So this got me thinking, you know, we always really dislike the argument when people say, oh, you should read adult fantasy because you're an adult. But I was thinking about it and I realized that I understand why people come with that argument, even though I disagree with it. I understand it. Because if you don't know a lot about YA, you just see, oh, there's fantasy books for young adults and there's fantasy books for adult books. So why, if you're an adult, wouldn't you just read adult books? But the thing is, they miss one very important thing. I need people to understand that the reason a lot of adults read YA instead of adult fantasy is not because they're not ready for the complexities of adult fantasy. It's because they find something in YA fantasy that they can't find or have a hard time finding in adult fantasy. And I believe this thing is the same as what we refer to as the YA vibe. Alright, so just to illustrate, I'm someone who really likes fantasy, but I do have a hard time getting into like more of the mainstream adult fantasy. I've tried to kind of find books, but I have to admit, when I look on Goodreads or I look up lists of popular fantasy books, I gotta admit that a lot of the synopses don't particularly sound interesting to me. Like, at least not in the way that YA fantasy synopses appeal to me and sound really interesting to me. So I'm having a harder time really specifically finding the stories that I'm looking for. And I think a lot of people might relate to this. I don't know, that they have a hard time finding the specific type of stories and styles and tropes that they love from YA in adult fantasy. Like, let me contrast this to another genre, contemporary romance. So I used to read sometimes contemporary romances, YA, which I always really enjoyed, but I have to admit that lately I'm not really into it anymore because I feel like I've kind of grown out of it. And I don't mean this in a way of like, oh, if you're an adult you can't read YA contemporary. Not at all. It's just me personally. I notice that I tend to just not relate to the YA romances anymore. So if I'm in the mood for a contemporary romance, I preferably, not always, but preferably I would go for an adult romance, just because it has the exact same vibe as the YA contemporary. I get the same kind of story as the YA contemporary, except with more mature themes, and the characters deal with problems that I can relate to a little bit more. So from my experience, it's very smooth sailing from YA contemporary to adult contemporary romance, if that's what you want. But I don't really find that smooth sailing from YA fantasy to adult fantasy, in my experience. And a lot of people do read both, like they branch out to adult fantasy, but I don't really see a lot of people just completely stepping away from YA fantasy unless they were never really interested in the genre in the first place. So I think that there is a specific type of story that we really find in YA but not really in adult. And the question is, why? Why is that happening? So remember, there's this huge group of people, this huge like cohort, generation of people who got into reading because of YA and have their needs met in the stories that they find in YA. I remember when fantasy was very much just a dude bro genre, but nowadays there are so many girls who also read fantasy, and I think that is largely due to YA and YA fantasy genre just reeling in a lot of girls. The problem is, as these people who got into reading because of YA grow older, they don't really have anywhere else to go, because it seems like the adult genre has not really caught up with these new readers and their specific needs. And right now, the solution to that is just for YA to grow with its audience. I say no, let the adult genre adapt a little bit more and start catering to and taking over part of that YA audience so that YA can remain YA. Because I am scared that the younger side of YA, like the 13, 14, 15-year-olds, is going to get left behind because publishers realize that it's actually more profitable to just market that huge cohort of now adults that still read YA instead of, you know, seeing that it's a good idea for there to be a specific genre specifically for teenagers that can get them interested in reading. So I really think that this YA bubble is going to burst at one point because YA cannot grow with its audience forever. It's gonna stretch itself thin at one point. And in order to keep the YA fantasy genre from imploding, I think the adult fantasy genre just needs to take over a little bit of those people so that the YA genre does not have to leave behind its younger audience. My conclusion is that there is an entire new generation of readers with different wants and needs that is growing up now, and I think the adult fantasy genre needs to expand in order to adapt to these different wants and needs. And I actually think this is already happening, like right now with YA giants like Leigh Bardugo and Sarah J. Maas publishing their first adult books and actually doing really well with them, I think shows that adult fantasy is very well capable of reining in that YA audience simply by providing us with the stories that we're looking for. By the way, I'm by no means implying that adult fantasy needs to stop what it's doing right now. I just mean this as an extra. And that's the point that I wanted to make. So like I said, it could very well be that you're watching this video and you think, Leonie, what the heck are you talking about? There are so many adult fantasy books that exactly cater to what you're talking about. If that's the case, I'm sorry that I missed something. Definitely let me know in the comments and give me some recommendations because I would love to hear. And last but not least, I do want to briefly touch upon something that I don't want to go into too much, but I do think is important, and that is the elephant in the room, that YA is generally read by women and girls. It mostly has female authors, it mostly has female main characters. That definitely has some influence on the discourse. Like a lot of people, we gotta realize that for some people the reason to read YA, or what at least contributes to them reading YA, is because it's the easiest way to find fantasy stories about women by women. Allegedly, the adult fantasy genre is notorious for its rather bad handling of female characters, and I know this is changing, so that's good. Now, I cannot confirm nor deny this because I don't think I've read enough like mainstream popular adult fantasy, but I have linked down in the description box 2 videos that go into this and also kind of go into the idea that usually things that are liked by girls are often shunned by society. And I think it's just important to know that whenever we make a video about YA, critiquing YA, we never do so in a vacuum. We're always influenced by our biases and our subconscious prejudices, however much we would like to believe that we're being objective and completely rational. So I do think it's important that when we make a video about it, we have to at least touch on this, and that's why I'm saying this right now. But if you want to know anything more, I want to redirect you to those links that I have in the description. I just want to emphasize the fact that I'm not saying that people who read YA fantasy just never like adult fantasy. That's not what I'm saying at all. I know like most people that I know just read both, but I just think they're quite different, and I do just find it interesting to look at YA as a genre that reined in a new type of reader that will maybe influence the book community even as they continue to grow up. Oh, by the way, I just want to say that my Etsy store is reopened again. The new bookmarks are in stock, so if you didn't get your hands on it last time because they sold out in 6 hours, go to the link in the description to my Etsy store. But yeah, definitely let me know what you think of this, what your experience is with reading YA and maybe branching out and trying new different things. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Bye bye!